So, my name's Maddie. I'm the Direct Action Coordinator for Resist Here, Project of Working Families organization. And today I'm going to talk about logistics and how to plan logistics for a mobilization or direct action. I'm going to be using a couple of examples that have happened just this year to illustrate the activities that need to be undertaken. So first I'm just going to talk for a bit, and then I'm hoping that at the end we'll have a good Q&A period, but this should probably be like about 20 minutes to half an hour of me talking, and then I would like to have like a wider conversation if that's possible. So first of all, I want to talk about what I mean when I say logistics. It generally means all the small details that make a direct action or campaign possible, including action support, training, and planning needs. Folks working on logistics will do things like secure spaces for meetings, mass housing and trainings, acquire food and distribute like water, supplies for medics, and organize support crews that include things like legal observers, medics, childcare, and jail support. Those two kind of different pieces. One is making sure spaces are secure, and one is making sure people and labor are secure. Those both tend to fall under logistics because those people that you're securing also need spaces. And the people that you're securing, whether they're volunteers or folks who work within other collectives that you're bringing into your collective to do work, are going to have other logistical needs, including things like food. They also might need childcare themselves. So it tends to be easier if the people who are wrangling logistical support folks are also the people who are managing the spaces in which they operate. In the way that direct action should take place in the context of an escalating series of actions and groundwork, along with escalating media pressure, logistics should begin gearing up in anticipation of action planning pretty far ahead of time. So if say you're trying to, in DC, we have the NEAR Act, which is a policy that was passed unanimously by our city council, but has not received funding. So let's say we're in a campaign trying to get the NEAR Act funded. We might build up to an action that disrupts the function of the Metropolitan Police Department in order to like leverage our power to secure that funding. So this would start a few months before we plan this big action, knowing that the actions that we're going to undertake in the meantime don't necessarily translate to immediate change, but they're part of a series of checkboxes. And in that series of checkboxes, you're getting legal observers trained, you're getting childcare like relationships secured, you're ensuring that folks who can provide food are like learning how to do that in an escalating fashion. So let's say you're starting off with like delivering a petition. If that's where your action levels are, and like your media presence is like, you know, over here, like we're writing letters to the editor, the phase of logistics planning that you should be in is in starting to build relationships with spaces that you'll be using for trainings, building relationships with collectives that you'll be using for support work, and sort of mapping out the spaces in the city that you're going to be needing to use in order to pull off a larger action down the line. It really sucks trying to pull off logistical support for a direct action with little heads up or little notice, depending especially on the scale and size of the action. So like logistics planning for a rapid response is very different from logistics planning for a mass mobilization because of the scale and because of the amount of training that's going to go into it. So in either case, you do want relationships with spaces where you can provide trainings and with spaces that can provide things like industrial kitchens for, you know, a food collective to come in and feed everybody. And that's something that you should be working on all the time anyway in your city or town. Planning a large-scale direct action requires a well-timed process, and in order to get participants trained, ensure maximum participation, and maintain the safest atmosphere possible, support roles from medics to dishwashing need to be delegated and filled. Some logistical support roles, like street medics, require specialized training. So not everybody can like enter in and like plug into those roles immediately. But things like washing dishes after a meal, anyone can do and everyone should do. Not only does that create sort of a sense of ownership over the space, but also like gives people the opportunity to kind of prove that they're like invested in their community. All of these types of work not only are collective responsibilities, as just mentioned, but also provide spaces for people to plug in. And don't let, one thing that I find happens a lot is that grunt work in particular, whether it's washing dishes or watching children or cooking, tend to fall on women and femme presenting people. Don't let that happen. If it is happening, don't feel bad about raising a stink about it. It's shitty, pardon my French, but it's a thing that's happened to me a lot. And it's happened to a lot of other people that like I care about and I think are otherwise very competent organizers, who tend to get shoved on the sidelines because other people aren't stepping in to fill those roles. So whether it's building that infrastructure where like men in particular anticipate the need for cooking and cleaning in these spaces, or anticipate the need for other forms of logistical support, like that's something that we really need to pay attention to and like honor equity in these spaces. Further, logistical organizing is, incredibly necessary, and it's often a place that people who can't do high-risk street actions, either for like reasons of disability, reasons of legal status, maybe they have a felony, maybe they can't get deported, or any of the myriad of reasons somebody might not be able to take a street-based role, can like plug in and do their part by providing food, securing spaces, handling the jail support phone line. Any of those other roles are, as valid and as necessary as like taking street action, but aren't necessarily quite as high risk. Except medics, that's a potentially high risk activity. So first I'm going to talk about roles. There are kind of two different ways that I tend to think about this. One is action support, and like I couldn't think of a better word, so just other support. So for action support, the folks who are also out on the street supporting people who are doing direct actions or participating in mobilizations generally are street medics. Most cities have a collective and a listserv within that city, and also nationally, street medics would call upon each other from other cities to join a mobilization or a direct action, and will bring supplies. They run in pairs. They usually mark up with red tape. They're pretty highly visible, and they do that on purpose. Also, there's no reason not to talk to your local EMS and firehouse. The more relationships, the better. And like, your organizing is successful when you have like people from sort of all walks of life participating in what you're doing. To get folks trained as medics, people will often have to go to another town to get that training. That's typical. But usually before a large mobilization, depending on the nature of the mobilization, there might actually be a street medic training like nearby. And that is much more doable when you have advance notice, especially by a couple of months. Legal observers, usually the National Lawyers Guild provides those folks. Sometimes the American Civil Liberties Union does as well. Pardon me. You don't have to be a lawyer to be a legal observer. They actually do trainings for free. The National Lawyers Guild is very responsive and most cities have a chapter. So if you get in touch with your local National Lawyers Guild chapter, ask for a training on that, and also like know your rights trainings. They'll, book a space, probably like at a local church or a rec center, and they'll like sit down and do an hour-long know your rights training. They'll sit down and train a bunch of legal observers. You usually see them with green hats on the streets and their little notepads. That's who to look for there. The other action support is jail support. So that's like for like action support roles, that's pretty much the easiest entry point. Basically, you show up at the courthouse after being, like, once all your friends are being released from jail. Bring snacks, bring shoelaces. They usually take your shoelaces. And also the jail support hotline. The National Lawyers Guild generally provides a hotline phone number to call. When you're in jail and you get your phone call, you call the National Lawyers Guild. Also, support folks outside watching arrests, call the National Lawyers Guild and try to report as many people with their full name. There's also typically a jail support form that will have your full legal name, date of birth, medications that you're taking or you might need in jail, emergency contact information, and what you would like the National Lawyers Guild volunteer to say to your emergency contact. Those are available online. We have resources and materials that have those documents on them. So that's it for action support roles. Those are all the different types of work going on in the street. The other one that you might not see or might not be quite so obvious is communications. Sometimes it comes in the form of like folks with walkie-talkies. Sometimes it's folks chatting on a Signal loop with each other. Signal is an encrypted text messaging service, and there's usually group chats that allow people to tell each other what is happening. Sometimes there are folks on bikes scouting to see, in the case of Gainesville, for example, there were a bunch of people running around reporting to each other activity from fascists running around on the ground. And they were able to stay a step ahead of every infiltrator, of every provocateur, and there were so many of them. But because they were in touch with each other and they had a team dedicated to that purpose, they were able to de-escalate any conflict before things got out of hand. I'm going to talk extensively about Gainesville at the end of this. It was really great watching them work. So those are action support roles and logistical roles. Other support, whether it's for like the training spaces, the mass housing spaces, meeting spaces, food is a big one. You can also get more people to come out to things if there's food. Food Not Bombs is a resource that's available in most cities, which is, generally speaking, volunteers who do their best to use reclaimed food. I think they also adhere to vegan standards of diet. And they will like volunteer to cook for various things. I was at a training all weekend, like a 16-hour long direct action and labor organizing training all weekend, and Food Not Bombs provided 2 meals for that, which was absolutely lovely. I'm in Baltimore right now. Anyway, another piece is to like find a really good chili recipe. It's underestimated, I think, how far a good like bean dish can go. But for the week of J20, we ate an incredible amount of chili, and the recipe was good enough that it was actually okay. So we fed close to, at our peak, 2,000 people for 10 days. Which that in and of itself, the crew that was responsible for doing that was probably between 15 and 20 people. If you include food It was a massive effort, but it worked out. And it drove the quality of the rest of our work. Food is just so important. One other piece that contributes to that is having good working relationships with bakeries in your area. And that's another thing you can do in the off season, like at the same time that you're like building relationships with these other spaces and with like the National Lawyers Guild and getting other kind of more generic trainings going. Off season, or when you're not directly planning an action, is a good time to start building relationships with like your Panera, your Einstein's Bagels, just to have like a running carb stash. Particularly before a large action, people are very anxious and like need access to like simple carbs. So another thing, I wouldn't underestimate it. The last one is childcare, which is usually the thing that's forgotten. So I wanted to like give it its own special due diligence. Many cities have a child care collective. If your city does not have a child care collective, I'm sure there are people in it who would be interested in investing time into a child care collective. And whether that's a thing that rotates from people's homes, whether that's just a few people getting together, or like, you know, a little corner of a meeting house so that a meeting can take place while one person like, you know, is keeping an eye out and like has some coloring books and some toys, whatever it is, it's a major barrier to participation when people can't access childcare, and like the cost of childcare in and of itself is incredible. So the fact that if we have the time and resources to provide that for each other, we need to be taking advantage of that, and we need to like lower that bar of participation. So, particularly the action roles. Why am I not bringing that up in the action training? I wanted to check in real fast. I said a lot of words. And I want to just indicate that there's a Q&A function on the screen. Like if you wave your cursor over the little box where I'm talking, you'll see a chat and a Q&A. So I just want to encourage, if anybody has any questions or anything that comes up, by all means, just jump in. And I'll address them as they come. So why am I not talking about this in the action training? That will happen. But each one of these roles is plugged into a series of other networks. So again, medics usually need a convergent space. They'll often ask for a separate one from the general population. Jail support needs food and also medics. Legal observers are often the same people as jail support. Childcare needs food. Like, so again, I wanted to give this its own due diligence because for years I have done it like kind of pigeonholed into like logistical planning for actions because folks don't, you know, it's not quite as sexy as action design. So I figured taking a good chunk of time to talk about these things kind of by themselves would be worth people's while. It's also easier to mobilize all these structures when the organizer has a consistent relationship and strong communications with the individuals that run these other collectives in other spaces. So if you're thinking about logistics and the things that you need in terms of space, the things that you need in terms of food, in terms of medics, after you've thought of your action design, you are doing things backwards. The logistics pieces probably should come first, because if you can't get those lined up, the quality of your action, the quality of the training, the quality of like the information going in and people's overall experience is going to decline. Plus, I mean, not all activism is action planning, right? Like if you can get more skillful at deploying logistical work by planning a speaking event or by planning a game night. Like those are the same skills. And it's a good way to train up other people and like delegate those tasks when you have these other non-action items that you're trying to like fulfill. So, you know, in that off season, do plan those game nights, do plan those speaking engagements, and like get folks that haven't done that kind of work in on that task, and that'll train them so that when the time comes for a big mobilization and everyone's running around and everything's crazy, you have more people with those relationships, with those communication skills available to distribute those tasks. Pardon. Okay. The other major thing is spaces. Cities that have a high level of activity usually have spaces that rely heavily on, that they're used to relying on heavily for trainings, meetings, cooking, etc. Churches are one of the most frequently used spaces. We have a handful of churches in DC, for example, that we tend to over-rely on. So in off seasons for us, which almost never happens because it's DC, it would be good for everyone if we started developing relationships with additional churches and other spaces in the city so that we weren't constantly weighing on the 2 or 3 spaces that we have available. And who knows what we're missing? There are tons of like rad and awesome like church managers, parishioners, like reverends, and also rabbis, and also imams, and also everybody else available. And like we really should be building those relationships and not pigeonholing. So if you can get a good warehouse, awesome, especially for like a party. If your town has rec centers that are still available, like go for it. Rec centers are amazing. But again, the relationship building is something that takes a long time. When you're playing in action, take time to develop relationships with potential ally spaces. And in that escalation process, if you're escalating to a direct action, maybe the first thing you do is plan a movie night that illustrates, you know, the issue at hand. Like if you're planning an IMF World Bank action 3 months from now, maybe the first thing that you do is plan a movie night. What's that? Life and Debt. Plan a movie night around life and debt. Go to this church, say, hey, I know we haven't spoken yet. I'm so-and-so. I'm with this organization. We are doing this thing, and we want to start with this movie night. After you get some donations to that church, after you prove that you can clean up after an event, after you establish that connection, keep using that space all the way up until you have this kind of big ask. And that big ask might include things like, I know the fire code says only 200 people can stay here, but we have 300 people who need housing. And if you've proven that you're reliable, and if you've proven that you're not a danger to this space's ability to continue existing, or that you somehow enhance the space's ability to exist, they're much more likely to, not actually count the number of people inside. So, with all that being said, in logistics, reputation means a lot. It also means a lot in action planning. Actually, organizing revolves a lot around reputation. For logistical work, a lot of it is like you return things on time. You get adequate donations for this space. It's like kind of much grittier than like the big kind of showy, like, oh, you pulled off an action that worked. Like no one's ever going to go to the logistics person and say like, oh, you pulled off an action that worked, even though it was just as much they're doing. Some miscellaneous stuff. Get acquainted with U-Haul. Like get really familiar with their website, figure out how all of their like payment stuff works. If you're hauling around a lot of materials, like you're probably going to haul around a lot of trucks. Get medic supplies from your nurse friend who works at the hospital. Book monthly Know Your Rights trainings and rotate locations throughout the city so you're maximizing the amount of spaces that you're developing relationships with, while also maximizing the accessibility for people within the city. And like you're getting different folks, new folks that you haven't seen, people working on other types of projects. Rotating your location for things is generally a good idea. Encourage men and like mask presenting people to take on logistical and support roles. And I can't underscore that enough. That is so important. Get a Costco membership, maybe split a Costco membership with like members of your org. Water is huge and important, and you can get it really cheap in huge amounts at Costco. or BJ's or Sam's Club. I personally am interested in cooperatively owning a pickup truck. So I don't know if anyone wanted to experiment with that. That's a good way to ensure that materials, especially art supplies, can move around really easily. Art logistics is like kind of sometimes one of the last things people think of. Like, that banner might be huge, you might have some puppets, and logistics folks tend to get stuck moving things around. So having access to a large vehicle is like great. And the last thing is, don't overextend yourself. For the most part, the tasks that you're going to be doing to logistically support an action are pretty intuitive, as long as people know that they need to be done, right? It's like, call this church. All right, call them again. Call them again. They're not giving you an answer. Just keep calling them. A lot of the work is just Googling things. And it's easy to delegate, but it's also easy to get caught up in, like, you know, if you're planning a very large action, delegation can become as stressful a task as just doing everything yourself. So if you start training people up early, if you start developing relationships early, you won't overextend yourself so much. You won't experience the burnout quite so harshly. So yeah, it's really one of those situations where, like, the relationships that you have kind of define your quality of life. So, with all that said, I've said my piece. Please, if anybody has any questions or comments, I'm here. I'm open. Hit that Q&A button or the chat button. Yes, if you want to. No pressure. Actually, I'm going to take a moment to talk about Florida. Just the other week, I was in Gainesville for Richard Spencer's talk at University of Florida. For those who don't know, Richard Spencer is a white nationalist and the leader of a white nationalist think tank called the National Policy Institute. So he was originally slated to speak sometime in September, but the hurricane, between the hurricane and students complaining that there were security risks, the university postponed the event. So in that time, an organization, a coalition, I should say, formed called No Nazis at UF. And this coalition consisted of Planned Parenthood, the Industrial Workers of the World, Dream Defenders, who else? The Gainesville chapter of the Women's March, several others. There was like 20 endorsements. And each one of those organizations kind of had their own special role. For example, the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, which is a union, was handling the jail support fund. Dream Defenders was handling direct action training. There was a street medic collective called the Gainesville Guerrilla Medics. That was the street medics. So each of these organizations kind of knew their role ahead of time. And in that time, they escalated from, simply writing about not wanting to have this event happen all the way up through direct action. And the day of the direct action was not only the protest outside isn't technically a direct action. The direct action piece was inside at the talk. They didn't want Richard Spencer to talk, so they chanted over him for the entirety of his talk. And you could tell the amount of love that went into this effort, because outside, and I didn't make it inside, outside, all of these little logistical pieces were lined up like to a T. You had comms folks on walkie-talkies. You had street medics, and we weren't allowed to bring bags in. So like for my part, I stuffed like every cargo pocket I had with all of the medic supplies I could possibly carry. Everybody else did the same. The night before, there was a spokes council where a group of there was a group of folks who came up from Miami to supply food. They sat the next day with the street medics at the street medic tent and like made sure people got fed, made sure people got water. We also weren't allowed to bring water bottles in. And so all of these predefined roles came together, granted in a very rapid fashion, but they had a month to escalate. And in that month, they had teach-ins, they had trainings, they had spokes councils. They ensured maximum participation by pulling people in all along the way and assigning tasks to all of them. And those tasks made for like an extremely successful action, ultimately. Sorry, I've got a question here. One question I got was, how do we get inactive members energized and motivated to show up and be active? I think logistical roles are one of the like best ways to get people plugged in because it gives them a sense of ownership without having, without requiring a ton of skill. So if somebody wants to be doing something but doesn't really like, you know, let's say you have an idea for like an escalating campaign that involves some scholar coming to town to do a talk about a book he just wrote. This is a great opportunity to do several things. One, to develop a relationship with, say, maybe a bookstore. Two, get unenergized people to participate in making this talk happen. And three, get otherwise like unenergized people into the talk to maybe become galvanized. So think about the people who are like, you know, they want to do something, they're already bought in, but they're bored. Say, hey, okay, we would like to have this movie night at this space, you book the space. And in having them perform that task, that's not only like something that they can like check off and feel good that they just did, but also like they have like demonstrated that by simply doing a task, like you're furthering a larger agenda. So I hope that answers that question. Whether like regardless of the size of the task, like any level of participation creates buy-in and creates like more of a sense of ownership than not doing tasks, even if those tasks are boring. So. Yeah. I think I'm always compelled to talk about J20, but I shouldn't. I'll give this a couple more minutes if anyone like emails in a question or wants to use the Q&A button. Another piece, I guess, in DC once a month, we have a spokes council, which a spokes council means a bunch of organizations come together and through literally the shape of like a bike wheel where you like have a bunch of people meeting in the middle with spokes coming out of them representing that organization. It just facilitates a conversation much more easily, and we have a lot of resources talking about it available through Resist Here. Although that's not an action, it's another space to kind of learn how to feel your way around logistics work because it requires a lot of the same moving parts, especially food and childcare, space booking, and also some of the groups that provide support roles should be in a participatory role here. Like there should be someone from your local medic collective on a spokes council, like representing medics. There should be someone from the National Lawyers Guild, like catching up on what's going to be going on in your city that month. So all of these things are kind of like drills for action planning. Anyway, unless anybody else has any questions, I'm going to wrap this up. So thanks for listening, and I will see you. I don't know if I'm doing another training. I might be. We'll find out. Anyway, have a good night.